Hello, everybody. Terrence Lehue here with another episode of the Intellectual Agrarian, where we talk philosophy from the farm. Our guest today has been in organic agriculture for over 25 years, wearing many hats along the way. For years, he was the owner-operator of Rock Springs Farm near Decorah, Iowa. More recently, he's been a consultant and host of the Farmer to Farmer podcast. Our guest today is Mr. Chris Blanchard. Today we'll be talking with Mr. Blanchard about what started the Farmer to Farmer podcast, what brought him to agriculture, keeping poop off the food, and much more. So enjoy this episode with Chris Blanchard. Chris, welcome to the show.
Hey, Terrence. Thank you for having me on the show today. Excited to be here.
Can you describe what you do in one sentence?
I think the most fundamental thing that I do right now is that I host and produce the Farmer to Farmer podcast.
That is an excellent way to start off. I'm just always curious to hear how people, especially like you who do so much, condense what you do into a single phrase.
Yeah, it's really become, I do a lot of other things, but I think that everything that I do now really does circle around the podcast because it's managed to get such wide distribution in the community.
Now, before we go farther, can you share a brief biographical sketch with the audience?
I actually don't have a brief biographical sketch, Terrence. And part of that's by temperament. I was actually just telling a Christmas story to my stepdaughter and my adult stepdaughter, and it took me about 15 minutes to tell something that happened at about, in real time about 2. But brief biographical sketch. Okay, so grew up in Seattle. Went to college at a place called Deep Springs College out on the California-Nevada state line. Weird little liberal arts college that was located on a working beef alfalfa ranch. Decided there that growing vegetables had all of the answers that I needed for everything that I had been wondering about in my life. Went on to do a horticulture degree at University of Wisconsin in Madison. Spent another 10 years working on vegetable farms around the country. In 1999, bought land in Northeast Iowa that became Rock Spring Farm and ran that for about 15 years. At the same time that I did that, I was also managing presentations and eventually co-directing the Moses Organic Farming Conference in La Crosse, the largest organic farming conference in the world, and did that pretty much the whole time that I was running the farm. The farm came to an end, and I moved into the consulting realm, which I had already been doing some of before the farm came to its end, and then started this podcast.
So what was it that led you to agriculture in general and sustainability in particular? So
my dad's an urban planner and was a kind of a wannabe hippie, and so I always grew up with kind of an environmental ethos. Even though I grew up right in the heart of Seattle, we literally, in the city there, back before Seattle was such a cool place. I mean, it was a cool place to live, but it wasn't quite the hip place that it is now. And so, and I grew up kind of on a diet of things like Richard Garrett and Edward Abbey and even Jimmy Buffett has a certain amount of an environmental ethos, and that was kind of the musical soundtrack of my life. And eventually read a book by Wendell Berry called The Unsettling of America that really got me thinking hard about agriculture and its role and how I could go about having a real impact in the world. I mean, it's one thing to read about stuff and go out in the, to go out in the environment or to do your share of recycling or to take mass transit as a way of life. But it's another to kind of figure out how you're going to actually have a practical, real life impact on the way things are, living your values. And when I landed at this place called Deep Springs College, so all of the students there work 20 hours a week or more on this beef and alfalfa ranch. It's an integral part of the school, even though it's a liberal arts college and is structured around, reading and writing. The labor is a really important element. But when I got into the garden I don't know. I mean, this always sounds kind of cheesy, right? But but it was like I was really struggling with a lot of questions about the meaning of life and death and how all of that stuff fit together, and just being there and planting seeds and seeing them come up and eating them and turning the remains into compost and sort of just being a part of this whole the participation in the great circle, right? The wheel of life. And I just went, oh yeah, this is it. I get it. And this is what I'm going to do.
Awesome. So since farming, you've shifted more into the consulting and in the podcasting. What do you typically help farmers with in your consulting work?
So Terrence, I'm actually not doing any consulting anymore. I've had to pull back from that for a variety of reasons. One of those just being the sheer amount of time that the Farmer to Farmer podcast takes. But in my consulting work, I mean, a lot of it was helping folks with business planning, helping folks with employee management and business systems. And then because it was something that was easy to make money at, I did a lot of work on food safety. You know, there's a lot of demand for that right now. We went through a GAPS audit in 2010 at Rock Spring Farm. And so I had some experience with that and somehow seemed to be able to frame that information in a way that people were able to understand. I think a lot of that food safety education, especially back around 2010, was coming from people that were used to regulating restaurants and food processing facilities and didn't really know anything about the practicalities of what it meant to do this stuff on the farm. And so I think I was able to bring kind of a farm-based perspective to that. And that also led into a lot of consulting around packing shed design. I still get a lot of questions about that. And so, yeah, I guess that was, I mean, it was kind of a wherever I can help with the consulting stuff. And all of that, I think, comes down to, at least in my mind, all of those things that we talked about. I mean, business systems, employee management, financial stuff on the farm, and food safety is all a matter of systems. And so I guess if you really wanted to sum up what I was doing with the consulting, it was really helping farmers implement better systems on their farm.
Well, I can certainly speak from experience that you do a good job explaining food safety. I attended your practical food safety lecture in, I think it was last year's Moses conference. And it's really kind of a tough topic depending on a person's background. And you do a great job making it understandable for a farmer and someone from a farming background.
Well, and I think so often, and I've often thought this about teaching. You know, I used to do some tutoring in calculus, and I did it because I had to take calculus twice. I took it in high school and didn't understand anything, and then I took it again in college and actually got it the second time through. But in college, I took it as an independent study with two other students, and ended up, because I'd been in the class before, because I had gone through a calculus program before, oftentimes taking what the professor had said and then explaining it to the students because I was getting it, because I was hearing it in a different way than I had heard it before. And they'd only heard it the one way and it wasn't making sense. Does that make sense what I'm saying there?
Yeah.
And so what I guess what that experience taught me is that a lot of times, and I think this is true, math especially, but in a lot of teaching, teachers approach things from the perspective of an expert. You know, so you've got math teachers who are teaching you about how to do math, who understand it so well that they don't understand how you could possibly not get it. You know, and it is kind of funny, right? You go to a food safety class. For me, food safety boils down to three things. When I really looked at what the principles of food safety are, right? You got to keep the poop off the food, right? Because the poop has the bacteria that makes people sick. So keep the poop off the food. Assume that you've got poop on the food, and then keep the poop from spreading from one piece of food to another. And then again, assume that you've got poop on the food and try to put conditions in place that help keep that poop from growing. You know, again, the bacterial component of that poop. And like when you say that to people, all of a sudden, instead of prescribing a bunch of techniques about this is what you need to do for worker training and proper, the rules and regulations around the proper construction of a packing facility. If you have a packing facility, you have to follow these rules. And instead of doing all of that, it really does empower people to say, oh, yeah, well, okay, keep the poop off the food. Well, I can look around the farm and figure out how I'm going to do that. I don't need an expert.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of the funny thing. I don't really consider myself to be an expert in food safety. I've just kind of, I've got a way of looking at it that seems to help people understand what they need to do.
It's really interesting you should put it that way, because I just read a book called Made to Stick by Chip and Dan Heath. They're the ones that also wrote Switch, but they talk about the curse of knowledge, which is when someone that is an expert, they know all this information, and they just naturally assume that you know at least part of it too, and you're sit there with your finger up your nose trying to figure out what they're trying to say because you don't know what they're saying. They're just speaking their language.
Exactly. And it's the same. I think it's the same thing we have when we talk about local food, or even like cooking and talking to customers about that, is you kind of have to get back and get into, sort of this beginner's mind where you don't know anything,
mm-hmm.
and say, let's all assume that when I say CSA, you don't know what I'm talking about. So what do I need to tell you about CSA if you know nothing to really make it make sense? And the interesting thing about that is that sometimes it gets you back to these principles. Sorry, I'm waxing here, right? I told you there are no short answers in my life.
That is fine.
Okay. And you get, I think a lot of times then you get back to the principles that are behind what you're trying to sell. And to take CSA as an example, for a lot of farms, when they say CSA, they end up just saying, well, it's a vegetable subscription.
Yeah.
Now, there are other farms that would never use that terminology around CSA. They would say it's a shared risk cooperative venture between the farmer and the eater, mm-hmm. and right there, those are two very different models of CSA. But instead of just using these words that sort of are somewhat meaningless because of how they're used and how often they're used, and this assumption that we all know what we're talking about when we say the word, if you actually back up and go, what if this person didn't know anything about CSA? What would I say? Then you get back to what the principles are that are behind it, especially in your particular situation.
And I think that that's one of the things that I enjoy most about the Farmer to Farmer podcast is that I came from a beef background. I'm an organic inspector. I worked with beef growing up. And now I work with a lot of processing organic feed. So vegetables have never been a major player in my life, but since becoming an inspector, I've had to learn more about it. And your podcast is an excellent resource because you and your guests do a good job of explaining a little bit more of the minutia in a way that's understandable.
Well, thank you, Terrence.
So moving on to the Farmer to Farmer podcast, what made you decide to start it?
Well, like we were talking about before the show, I was doing consulting. I was in the process of selling the farm, and I had, so I was moving on and was going to try to make a living doing the consulting full time. And I looked at the podcast as a way to kind of establish my expertise in the field. And there's this idea that I've read about called marketing gravity. When you want to be a subject area expert, so that when somebody goes, oh, I need a consultant on my farm to come in and help me plan my business, they go, oh, get Chris Blanchard here. That's what I was looking at the podcast to do. It's turned into something that has its own life. And again, to the point where I've really have pulled back from the consulting. So that was the motivation behind it in a practical sense. I mean, if you want the business reason that I started it, but the other thing, I've been so lucky in my life to be guided by really fantastic mentors, people that I've had a lot. I mean, I think some of it is that I put myself out there, but some of it is that I was just in the right place at the right time. I think about, somebody who I'm sure that most of your audience, doesn't know, Farmer Dave Steidel and his wife Jane at Deep Springs College. I mean, if I hadn't started under their tutelage, I wouldn't be where I am. They got me connected up with Amigo Bob Cantisano, with Michael Abelman out when Michael was at Fairview Gardens Farm in Santa Barbara. That work there, talking to those people and working for Michael Abelman got me what I needed to be able to leverage that into working for a fantastic plant breeder, Stan Peliquin, at the University of Wisconsin. Met John Navazio, who now works with Johnny Selected Seeds and is kind of one of the premier people in organic seed production and seed breeding. He got me connected up with Seed Savers Exchange. I had the good fortune to work for Richard DeWild at Harmony Valley Farm, who was, really, I think, one of the first great farmers who really had a lot of vision about how to get organic vegetables in the Midwest into grocery stores. And really had a keen eye for the trends and what was required to make organic produce accessible to your average consumer. Stumbled into some work with Cascadian Farm, ended up farming across the bay from Elliott Coleman in Maine. I mean, right, all of this by way of saying, again, long answer, I've been really fortunate to be in contact with a number of great people over the course of my career. And then the Moses Conference, when I started working there, I was actually, I counted them up one time. I had over 1,000 presenters that I worked with during my time at the Moses Conference. And, these were people, some of them were very famous. Some of them were well recognized for what they did in the field. Some of them were subject experts on a very narrow topic. And we were bringing them kind of to the forefront and putting them on stage for the first time and saying, hey, you've got something to offer to the community. And I really felt like doing an interview format podcast was a way to continue that work that I had done with the Moses Conference of bringing voices, whether they were famous or whether they were kind of canonical voices in the organic farming world, or whether they were just people that were doing something interesting or doing a good job, and saying, hey, you've got something to offer and you've got a story to tell. And I was able to leverage my own experience, my 25 years that I had spent in the organic vegetable world at that point, and use that to draw out the stories that these other people had and the expertise that other people had and the perspectives that other people have. And that's just been, I think that was I wouldn't have put it all that way before I started the podcast, but I know that was somewhere in the back of my mind. And that's really been, that's been the best part of it.
If this is your first, 5th, 6th, or 12th helping of the show, we aren't going to tell you to stop like Aunt Mildred during dessert. Instead, we want to send you our top episodes in what we call the grocery bag, because they're about the food you eat and how it's grown, knowledge that you can take straight to the kitchen. Go to intellectualagrarian.com/bag. Once again, that's intellectualagrarian.com/bag to get the grocery bag sent directly to your inbox, or click in the link below. There, we've got great episodes about farm-to-table dining, organic grains, and so much more. So be sure to go to that link and get the grocery bag for knowledge that you can take straight to the kitchen. Now, back to the show. What are recurring themes you found with some of the farmers you've interviewed?
It's funny because whenever I talk about a recurring theme, I almost immediately do an interview the next week that goes completely in the face of that.
Well, that means I'm looking forward to next week's interview.
I would say, the biggest theme that has come out, and one that really surprised me because of my own background and my own habits around work, is the number of people that have put some sort of constraints on how they're going to spend their time. People who've said, we only work in the fields from 8 to 5, Monday through Friday. The rest of our time, we do marketing, we do bookkeeping, whatever that might happen outside of those times. But, we're out of the house from 8 to 5. And there's a whole variety of those. There's a whole I mean, there's a wide array of how that happens. That's I think that's what J.M. Fortier told me. 8 to 5 in the field on his farm. That's exclusive of marketing time, exclusive of kind of the book work time. Paul Arnold, on the other hand, Pleasant Valley Farm out in Argyle, New York. Paul and Sandy, again, being another example of people that I stumbled into and got to know through sheer luck, and who took me under their wing and said, "Hey, Chris, we're going to be your friend and your mentor." And no good reason for them to do that, but they did. That's, again, something I wanted to be able to give back, but that's off the topic of what we're talking about here. So Paul Arnold works like a madman. The guy's up at sunrise every day. He works all day, comes in at sunset, eats really well, enjoys his life, goes to church on Sunday. But I mean, he's probably on average putting in 60 to 70 hours a week. But they go on vacation, and they go on lots of vacations, and usually a big one in the winter, and then they go on one in the middle of the summer. So they've got this constraint on what they're willing to do on their farm. It's not 24/7, 365. It's 24/7, 300. And they take a lot of time off. And so all of these different ways, I guess, that people put constraints on their time. Because for me, the thing that I was the foolish thing that I was always proud of when I was farming was how hard and how long I worked. And, in retrospect, I didn't take enough vacations. I didn't take enough time off to spend with my kids. And, that's something I'm still working to recover from. It's a source of regret for me. And I actually think the farm would have been better off if I had taken that time, if I had put some constraints on it. So that's something, to me, that's come up so often in the podcast that I guess, when people ask me what is the recurring theme, that's the one I keep coming back to.
Mm-hmm. It's a very important one too. Growing up on the farm, my father had the same problem. He is one of those guys that he'll just work and work and work and work and work. And now he's doing a better job of taking more time and stepping back as he's getting older. But it makes a difference when you can pace yourself.
Well, and I'll say one of the things about work, and I still find this to be attractive about the work that I do now, is that it's easily definable outcomes, right? And you go out and you do things, and stuff happens, right? If you go out and plow a field, all you have to do is look behind the tractor, and you know that you're getting something done. You know that you're getting the result that you wanted out of. That's a lot harder when it comes to investing in relationships or investing time in personal growth, or even professional growth. I mean, it's a lot harder to, you make time to sit down for dinner with your family and have a deep conversation. That doesn't always yield immediate results. And so work, I think, is sometimes an easy refuge. That's certainly how I found it to be. It's an easy refuge. Even now, I know that sometimes when I get frustrated or I'm having a hard time in the rest of my life, I actually tend to work more than when things are easy, and my relationships are solid.
That's an excellent observation, and I'm going to have to remember that one. What are 3 top episodes of the podcast, if you could narrow it down to maybe 3 top ones, that you'd recommend for the audience to listen to?
Terrence, you realize when you ask me a question like, what are the top 3 episodes of the podcast, or the ones that I would recommend? We've done 150 shows now. And so really what you're asking for here, when you ask for the top, you're asking for the top 2% of the show. Yep. I can't do it. Okay.
I totally understand that.
And I guess when I look back over my list of episodes, over the spreadsheet that I keep that has them all there, a lot of the early ones stand out for me. I think it's to some degree because those have just had a longer time to percolate. you know. I go back, really one of my favorite interviews, just for the solid information that it had, was one with John Peterson from Angelic Organics Farm. That's episode 4. If you want to search for it on the Farm to Farmer podcast website, you just type in 004, because that's how we number the episodes. And John talked about his weed control system. And what I loved was, and I love the episodes that we've done where we've dug into tools and techniques for weed control, and, fancy things like finger weeders and all this other stuff. John Peterson manages his weeds with a really dead simple system. It's knives and sweeps, and some basket weeders, which are pretty universal, and a tine weeder. But then the big thing that he's doing is he's got a really interesting crop rotation set up where, listen to the episode. I just think, he takes this whole different approach to controlling his weeds and doing his rotations that just really makes a ton of sense, and I think is easily applicable in a wide variety of settings. Dan Kaplan, episode 26, again, 026, or search for Dan Kaplan's name if you're looking for it. Dan Kaplan from Brookfield Farm out in Massachusetts talked about his CSA farm. And Dan really, this episode really touched me, because he talked about this idea of a shared experience of loss, and that's what CSA is really about, and that we don't have in our society many opportunities to experience loss in a real way in our modern world. And he talked about CSA as an avenue for people to experience that. That episode, I felt like, was kind of a breakout episode for the show too. It's one that generated a lot of conversation, and for me, for that reason, is also special to me. The other one, and I'm actually going to cheat here and say 2 episodes, because these were both with Jess and Brian Powers. I had them on in episode 40, and then I had them back for episode 123 to talk about some of the changes on their farm. But Jess and Brian, good example of people that work really hard. They don't really put any limits on the hours that they're working, but they do put other constraints on their world. And the big one that I remember from these guys is that they put constraints on, they will always eat good meals together, and the importance of the food on their farm, and really running a very lean operation with just the 2 of them to start with. And then they actually expanded and added an employee this year. But just the passion and the story of their journey to getting to the farm and being together, and really the love that they bring to it. And, and I'd say those aren't my 3 favorites, but those are 3 of my favorites. I would say almost all of the episodes that I do are, I end them and I feel like I know these people, and I feel like they've become my friends. I mean, 90 minutes is a pretty long conversation to have with somebody, and you get to know a lot about them, even just by hearing their voice. It's not just the things that they say, but how they say it. And having to pick 3, that's just not fair, Terrence.
Well, I certainly have to say people should listen to all the episodes. They're all worth it. They're all interesting, and they're perfect for the car ride, commuting here and there.
Thank you so much.
Now, this is a question that I'm asking slightly for selfish reasons, maybe, but how do you select and write questions for your guests?
I don't. Typically, before I invite somebody to be on the show, I know something about them. I know that there's a reason that I want to have somebody on the show. And so I'll start with that. And then I'll do some research about them and learn what I can about their farm, from what's on the internet, or from what people have said. If somebody says you should have Terrence Leahy on the show because he's doing X, Y, and Z, I'll make sure that those are topics that we're going to cover. I don't tend to formulate the questions in advance. I sort of have a list of talking points, things that I want to make sure that we cover, and then just kind of go from there. And a lot of times we miss a couple of those points, and a lot of times I find there are these whole other rich avenues that you would never know about a farmer from their online presence or from what other people have to say about them.
The genuine joy of having a conversation. Again, that's one of the things that's nice about the show is that they feel like real conversations instead of stilted, long-form interviews, which, depending on some podcasts, can kind of get that way.
Well, and I want to say, I mean, if we look at the first 10 episodes of the show, there was only one person in there that I wouldn't have considered a good friend before we started. And I think, that gave me a lot of leverage to be able to go in and not have to come in with a list of questions. We really were able just to have conversations. And then I think that gave me the confidence and the structure to continue doing that.
Well, the last question I want to ask you here is one that I've been percolating a little bit, especially with everything that's going on in the organic area with regenerative versus sustainable. But how do you define sustainability? What does sustainability mean to you?
Well, that's a thunker. I guess to me, I mean, and it's going to be a little bit cheesy, right? But you got to have. I'm going to kind of go back to holistic management, or what we used to call holistic resource management. Alan Savory's, the school of thought that developed out of Alan Savory's work. And, he talks about 3 elements to creating what he calls this holistic goal. But I think it's a good discussion of sustainability, right? You need to have a quality of life. You need to have a means of production, and you need to have a resource base that's going to be there for you in the future. And I think those are really the 3 legs of sustainability to me, right? You can't have sustainability if you don't have quality of life. And quality of life is something that I think gets defined on an individual level. For some people it is. I go back to this issue of people putting constraints on their farming. I mean, for some people, they don't need any constraints. The farm is enough. That is their quality of life. For other people, they need those vacations. For other people, they need to be done in the field at 5:00. But you need to have what you need, not necessarily to be happy, but to be satisfied, I guess. You need to have a means of production, right? You need to have a way to generate the cash that you need to run your business. And a lot of times that's something that's going to feed into the quality of life. One of the things that used to break my heart when I was doing consulting was going on to farms where people were struggling so hard and not making it, right? They didn't have the means of production that they needed to get to a quality of life that was what they were expecting and what the people around them would expect them to have. And so having a way of doing that production, I grow vegetables for a living. That's what provides my money. I need that. And I need that to be something that can provide money for me this year and is going to also provide money for me next year and the year after that, and the year after that. And then that third leg being this future resource base. And this is really what I think a lot of people think of when we talk about sustainability. I need to have the soil needs to be there. I need to have, at the bigger level, we need to have a climate that's going to be stable. We need to have people who can do the work. We need to have technology that can help make that work easier or more pleasant or more efficient. All of those things are kind of that future resource base when we look out and say, how are we going to make sure that we maintain that? This is where I think the sustainability, I really like this holistic perspective. And I want to talk just a little bit about that future resource base and my experience at Rock Spring Farm is that, in the beginning at Rock Spring Farm, we weren't very good employee managers. We were really hard on people. And we burned a lot of bridges in our small town. And my farm actually became known locally as the Yelling Farm. People people avoided working there. Or if you found out about our farm, and if you were going to college at Luther College and you found out about Rock Spring Farm, thought that might be a cool place to work, and you asked at the local food co-op, there wasn't a single employee at the co-op that wouldn't have said, you don't want to work there. Those people they're hard to work for. It's the yelling farm. Well, we had really destroyed our future resource base of employees in that situation. In a very practical sense, that wasn't sustainable. We had to learn, and then I had to learn how to be a good manager and how to really engage with my employees and how to structure my farm so that it worked not just for me, but for them too. And gradually built that resource base back up to where people did want to come and work at Rock Spring Farm, and where it was a fun place to be, and where people felt satisfied there. And that met, I guess, one little piece of sustainability there for the farm operation.
I love how you took this and went to not simply agriculture to employee management, because I really do think that sustainable principles should be applied to everything and anything for the most part in our lives. Part of the reason we're doing the show is because of that. Chris, thanks so much for being on the show. Where can people learn more about you and your work?
Yeah, the main place that I'd like to point people at this point is to the Farmer to Farmer podcast, which, farmertofarmerpodcast.com is where we've got information about the show. And of course, just listening to the show, I think is a good place to learn about what we're doing. And on Facebook, we're at Purple Pitchfork. We're at Purple Pitchfork on Instagram, fairly active on there right now. So those would be some other places to look us up.
Thanks again, Chris. And we'll have all that information linked in the description below.
Right.
Thanks again, and have a great day.
It was my pleasure, Terrence.
Thanks again to Chris for being on the show. You can find the links to the Farmer to Farmer podcast and the work they do in the description below. Or search Farmer to Farmer podcast wherever podcasts are listened to. Speaking of podcasts, if you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to subscribe, and while you're there, leave us a review wherever you listen to podcasts: iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, Overcast, Podbean, wherever is your preference. Thanks again. As always, I'm Terrence Lehue. This has been the Intellectual Agrarian, reminding you to keep farming the dream.